Good morning and welcome back to Real Estate Live UK. Our weeks of free to attend virtual events run 3 times a year in February, June and October. The programme is brought to you by White Label, our partners and sponsors, and we'd like to take this opportunity to thank all the organisations that have contributed to the exceptional lineup taking place this week. During the sessions this week, places across the UK will be showcasing investment opportunities, and industry-leading experts from the public and private sectors will be discussing new ideas and topical issues relating to property. You can view the full programme of sessions taking place on our website, www.realestatelive.co.uk. Several of our panels and presentations will be linked to our key themes for the week: driving green investment, promoting healthy places, redefining town centres, and homegrown tourism and leisure. Right now, we have a session in partnership with Commonplace where we ask, what is the future of community engagement in the built environment? And just before we start, I'd like to remind you, the audience, to please feel free to ask your questions using Zoom's Q&A function. And now I'm pleased to hand over to our chair for this session, Jen Miller, Director at Commonplace. Over to you, Jen.
Thank you, Callum. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the session today. To just get started and to frame the context of the session, going to go through just a little bit of a presentation. And the idea is to give you a sort of a feel for some of the research that's gone into community engagement during COVID, but also what does that look like for the future. I'm joined by an outstanding panel, have Kate Nottage from Grosvenor, Professor Gavin Parker from Hindley Business School, who also is on a committee for the New Forest Planning Authority, and Matt Griffiths-Rimmer from Hadley Property Group. So we have a nice mix of academics as well as practitioners to talk through this key topic. As a background, Commonplace is a digital hub for community engagement. We have a mix of different solutions ranging from maps to drop a pin and allow your communities to have their say, to surveys and polls and other qualitative feedback mechanisms, news, as well as integrations with tools like View City, to enable the community to really engage and understand what plans and placemaking can look like for them, and whether that's public or private sector, to have the ability to have their say. Commonplace has worked on over 1,000 projects in the UK with over 3.5 million respondents. And what that means is that we have a nice set of rich data around digital community engagement and what people actually want to have their say in. And last year, with the Planning for the Future white paper, we worked with a number of different groups and actually did a response called Engaging for the Future, which I can share the link in the session and also following. And what we found is that the communities actually want to be engaged. And there's a few key headline findings that community engagement should be a conversation, not a one-off survey. And I think one of the things we've seen more over lockdown is that has started to shift, and public and private bodies are actually trying to have this dialogue with the community. It needs to be a process, not just an event, and it needs to happen at the various stages of planning and feeding that back. And then also it needs to build trust, and that's built through transparency as well as ongoing engagement. And what we found is that people that have engaged once are 5 times more likely to come back and contribute again. So if you're not finding ways to keep them engaged or engaging them to begin with, you're missing a very rich set of understanding from the community on how to change places. From our research, we found that 76% of those polled actually want to participate in planning, and they believe they need a greater say over their area. 71% also want ongoing updates. So as opposed to just, again, a planning notice and some feedback, they want to know what the outcome of that feedback is and what that means to them. But actually only 27% of those we polled have actually taken part in a planning consultation. And we asked why. And it's come back with really 3 core barriers to engagement. So the first is a lack of awareness. So 48% of people have actually never heard or even been able to engage with a consultation in their area. They also don't really think they have any influence. So only 27% actually think they have influence, and 58% believe that decision lies with the local council, and 40% believe that lies with developers. And lastly, people believe that decisions are made in secret. And so 50% thought that to avoid any public backlash, the public and private sectors alike are actually not providing that transparent view of plans and what that actually means to them. We also done some additional research with MHCLG and Innovate UK on the actual planning notices themselves. And one of the key findings is that it's just hard. Typically, you have notices in paper, notices on lampposts, or even letters or notifications going out. And it's hard to follow, understand exactly what that means to them, but also to engage. And often the time in which they're seeing it is disconnected from the time they could actually give that feedback. And so the idea is that the panel today will kind of talk through some of these challenges and be able to help provide some insight into how we can do a bit better, especially off the back of COVID, where people are more engaged digitally. And that is a trend that we hope to see in the future. You can also download our ebook, which I'll send the link to. And if you want to get in touch, this is my information. Now over to the panelist, which is the main event. So first up, we're going to have Professor Gavin Parker from Henley Business School, who's actually going to talk about the role of community engagement in the planning process and how has that changed since COVID. Then we'll have Kate Nottage, who's the head of community engagement from Grosvenor, actually talk about how they've adapted their strategies during the pandemic. And then Matt Griffiths-Rimmer, who's the director of comms and partnerships at Hadley Property Group, to just talk through some best practice in communication or in community engagement following COVID. So I'll go ahead and stop my sharing and over to you, Gavin.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Jen. As already introduced, I'm Gavin Parker. I'm based in Department of Real Estate and Planning, which is Henley Business School, but University of Reading to many people in real estate, as you probably would recognise. Thanks very much for the invite to come in. Try and keep my comments brief. Quite a punchy kind of short kind of session we've got here. I think I just want to say at the very beginning, this is a great opportunity, for researchers such as myself to kind of get our work and some of our ideas and thoughts out to and into the industry. It's something that's been picked up, in discussions between University of Reading and our wide kind of network of people out there in real estate. So it's a great opportunity. I'm just going to put a link into the latest kind of research that we've done on community involvement in planning. It only came out just a few days ago, so I don't necessarily expect people to have read it. And I'm not going to kind of sit here and do a whole kind of short overview of it. My brief really is to talk mainly about where we've gone with COVID and what that has meant and how that's impacted on engagement opportunities and actually existing practice. And indeed, the research that I'm referencing there, slightly different, I hope quite complementary, and indeed one or two of the findings resonate very closely with the Commonplace research around needing to kind of foster a relationship, an ongoing relationship with people through the system. But our research was more about first principles and also about actually existing practice out there. And we tended towards looking at local authorities who had attempted to go beyond, if you like, the statutory minimums and what we could learn from that, but very much within the context of planning reform agenda. And I'll come to that in a moment, if I may. In terms of the COVID kind of experience, Jen mentioned there in terms of the intros that some of you may already know, but I'm chairman of the New Forest National Park Authority and have been on the planning committee as a local planning authority. I've been on the planning committee there, and we were one of the first authorities in the country to run the first online virtual planning committee. And we think overall the experience of that 15-month period was very successful, actually. And proved to be a pretty popular kind of shift, both in terms of enabling participation, but also widening the audience for the, if you like, the mechanics, the business of making planning decisions, and hopefully raising some of the awareness that Jen mentioned there. People could kind of dip into the meeting, or they could look at the kind of the screencast afterwards. And And indeed, even before COVID, some progressive authorities had been moving towards, webcasting planning committees and so on. And it's a great shame. I think it's quite a widespread view now. Quite a shame, really, that government have moved to basically force local planning authorities to having their planning committees face to face again. We would like to see a more hybrid approach, and I'm sure that those of you out there and have got your finger on the pulse know that MHCLG have been running a consultation on this very question, and it runs out shortly. It was launched towards the end of March for 12 weeks, so you can do the maths. It runs out towards the end of the month, and we actually think that it helped us in terms of sharing the work of the authority, and showing how deliberative the planning committee's work actually is. And I would even, this is what I'm going to seg towards the reform planning system, I'd also be kind of, mindful of showing how the exercise of both professional judgment, but also the interaction of planning committee, thinking about the quite nuanced considerations about individual planning cases, how diligently that is done, up and down the country, and certainly within the New Forest. So we think it's a great way to showcase planning to a wider audience, a more inclusive kind of approach. And I think that's one of the agenda items, hopefully, that the planning reform process will engage with. So I'll just shift forward, because I've only got this relatively short amount of time, to the reforms themselves. When we did the research that I've put in the chat bar there, we decided to frame it so that we were always putting questions to ourselves, and in terms of what we were producing, against the kind of criteria that are found within the planning white paper itself. So government are still obviously really interested in speed. Whether we believe it or not, local plans are supposed to be produced in 30 months. At least that's the conceit that we're still kind of running with. We'll see. They want to develop more certainty, particularly certainty for development industry. They want to improve design. They want to embrace the digital kind of frontiers that Commonplace and others have been leading on, and they want to improve engagement overall. And of course, we know that sits around this whole idea of bringing participation towards the front end, the front-loading participation. Commonplace's research, our research says you can do far more there. You can be more deliberative. You need to think about new tools. You need to embrace things like citizen panels, citizens' assemblies, those types of tools, perhaps, to open up the process very early on. It's quite dangerous to rely on that for high quality outputs, and to develop the kind of trust that we're so lacking of in terms of the way the public currently view planning process and outcomes. You've got to take the public all the way along, and not only try to rely only on a bolstered front load. Bolstered front load is very important, but it's not everything. So in terms of what I wanted to kind of close on, all of this is going to need resourcing. It's going to need better skills. It's going to need nothing less than a big culture shift within local planning authorities. And one of the only ways to prompt that and to make that happen is to make sure that the regulatory requirements are going to enforce, in a sense, that shift. I think the lessons over the decades have been that local authorities with limited resources, they will play to the whistle. They will follow what they have to do, and only very few will go beyond that, because they are concerned about, obviously, the costs. They're concerned about some of the other kind of intrinsic questions around planning white paper reforms already, around speed, and what it may mean in terms of slowing down local plans. So it's going to need quite a fundamental shift, and it's going to need central government to play a really, really important and strong role in terms of enabling that shift to take place. So I think, Jen, I'm going to have to stop now, because I've probably gone on from beyond the 5 minutes. But there are lots of things I could add to. lots of things that might come through from questions from the audience, I'm happy to help with, because we've also recently done the research for MHCRG on neighbourhood planning, which came out last year. And we've also been doing a spin-off bit of research specifically on statements of community involvement, which we know that are also up in the frame to be rejigged. So that's where I'll close. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Gavin. Fantastic. Yeah, I think there's already some questions coming in around, speed, and as that's a core parameter within the Planning for the Reform white paper, and then actually engagement. It seems that those two things are at odds with each other. So I think we'll have some interesting dialogue about that. And it also segues really nicely into the work that Kate's been doing at Grosvenor. And I know they've recently done a community charter on positive spaces where making the time for engagement is really important. So actually, Kate, I'll go ahead and pass to you to sort of comment on that and also share your ideas.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Jen, and thanks, Gavin. That was great. So I lead on community engagement for Grosvenor, Britain and Ireland. We're a 340-year-old company that started out with the development of Mayfair and then Belgravia in the 1670s. Those neighbourhoods today host around 50,000 workers, around 10,000 residents, almost 1,000 businesses. But we also have a development pipeline of around 30,000 homes in other areas of London and across the South East. So making, managing and evolving places is what we do. And we can't do that without the communities in those places. So how we work with those communities and balance competing priorities is key for us. Yes, and so onto the pandemic. Well, it's certainly shed a light on the importance of community, and it's forced the pace of change in some aspects of how we are working with communities, in particular around the digital infrastructure we have and being able to switch that on and off really quickly, our social media presence, how we run workshops digitally while still giving participants more of an offline experience. And fundamentally, it's highlighted who we need to be hearing from and who we're not hearing from, having seen many of the communities we work with in a new light over the last year. But I agree with Gavin, and I think there's a more systemic cultural change in the industry that we are bit by bit waking up to, which Grosvenor has been championing in recent years. But that is what I think is a more fundamental shift here over the pandemic itself. And that shift that bit by bit we're getting there with, but probably not quite quickly enough, is quite simply that engagement matters to society, to people's well-being, to business. It creates better places, it generates value, it minimises risk. So we've got to do it properly. And I think we are getting there, but it's not quickly enough. And there's probably a bit too much talk and not quite enough action. So I think the challenge for us now, and in particular in a discussion like today, is to talk about how we force a pace of change in that action and how we turn the great ideas and discussions that are becoming increasingly commonplace in the industry into meaningful, immediate change. And so what's Grosvenor doing about that? Well, in the last year, yes, Jen, thanks, we've developed a community charter to raise the standard of our engagement as a business. We've run an internal training programme for around 50 employees on it. We've published a youth engagement toolkit and set up a youth forum, but we are certainly on a journey too. We've still got a lot of work to do. So in closing, I agree with Gavin, the industry is getting there, but we need policy to require the industry to get there quickly. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah, I know. I definitely think it's true, because I think the policy forces the internal teams to actually do something. And I think that often is one of the big challenges is of how, the external side, you can engage with the community, but how do you get the internal team to see the value of that and champion that and actually execute from that feedback? I'll now pass over to you, Matt, to talk about some of the work that you're doing at Hadley.
Great. Thanks for having me, Jen. And thanks to Gavin and Kate for the insights. So I'm responsible for the comms here at Hadley. We're a London-based regen specialist. We've probably got around 3,500 homes in our pipeline at the minute, just across the city. So we're a medium-sized developer, but growing fairly quickly at the moment. So when lockdown started, I think there was a school of thought within the industry that a wholly digital consultation was kind of going to create some sort of almost like a super NIMBY culture. One with people having additional time at home to spend poring over planning documentation, and certainly with people much more keen to let you know exactly what they think of your proposals. But in fact, it kind of emphasised to us certainly just how little time people had. or how little impact that they believed they could have on the planning process. So we learned that it was really important to make it snappy and make all your content really digestible and above all user-friendly. So COVID kind of removed all of the hiding places that the development industry previously had, where physical exhibitions that were promoted in a single language with letter drops in a community hall, they're not really built for residents to attend, but more for developers to be able to say that they've hosted them, but no one really showed any interest. So without this enforced shift to 100% digital, without webinars or virtual town halls or Q&A events that are much easier for people to attend online than they would have been, then it meant that developers either went the whole hog or they did nothing, which they couldn't really do because then the planning proposals were all going to get held up. So it created a little bit of a kick in the backside for the industry in general, I think. And we committed a little time and energy and resource during lockdown and just developed an exhibition space. So just something that could mirror traditional physical offerings, but it was also quite respectful of people's time. So as well as sort of bite-sized chunks of presentation material, we wanted to include as many explainer videos, stop motions, fly-throughs, and before and afters, just quite everyman stuff. So it gave us some good dwell times. We were getting 4 or 5 minutes on the platform, which meant that people were engaging. And we were getting anywhere between sort of 300 and up to 700 responses, which meant that the feedback was really representative of that kind of half-mile radius. Just on best practice, because that's what I was asked to talk about. There's no real hard and fast rule for us. Every scheme is different, but there are some key factors that we picked up from. We took like 4 schemes through consultation last year. The first one is step away from your statutory requirements. So engage holistically and do it outside of your red line. So alongside speaking about height, bulk, massing, and materiality, get into social impacts and sustainability. They should become key factors on engagement, because now we're dealing with publics that are much more aware of what brands should stand for. They're much more aware of what they can expect of a company. There's certainly companies that are claiming to do things the right way. Social media has kind of made companies much more accountable in a way that just wasn't possible in years gone by. You can pull research from your obvious sources, such as indices of multiple deprivation, etc. Take advice from elected members, from community leaders, and do all this kind of at the point of acquisition, if not pre-acquisition, really. For instance, at Blackwall Yard in Tower Hamlets, we took really early soundings on local charities who we talked to about partnering with, where we should be volunteering. Then we asked a series of questions to local residents, which didn't specifically relate to just our site. So which local public spaces nearby might benefit from developer contributions, what's lacking in the neighbourhood, what they would have to leave the area to engage with, or what they felt that the residents, they already had an abundance of in the area. So this kind of helped us to establish genuine areas of influence. There's no point in asking as a developer if you're asking a resident if they want a tall building next to their estate, because they probably don't. But if you're asking what type of shop, restaurant, cafe you might include within your proposals, what kind of charitable uses would be most welcome, all of those things are within your gift to provide as a developer, and they're all a significant use to the local community. Also, it's probably worth thinking outside your comfort zone in how you approach people. So digital engagement isn't just about bringing young people on board, but rather about trying to bring all people on board. So you have Facebook for the mums and dads. We were using TikTok and Instagram. We use Spotify to try and bring some people along to the platform as well. And for those who aren't digitally literate or digitally excluded, we still use phone lines and SMS questionnaires and traditional letter drops as well. And then just thirdly, consider your timescales and your programs to planning and how you might want to incorporate that feedback. So go out and talk to people early and make sure that you've got the flexibility in your master plan to be able to incorporate the feedback. So what we found is we were surprised at how positive people can be when they are given a voice about their community. We would normally go out in 2-3 phases across that sort of like maybe a 6 to 8 month planning process, and just ensure that there's a healthy amount of you said we did in everything that we publish. And then just to accompany that listening exercise, ensure that you retain flexibility in your responses to the feedback that you've received. So for instance, we had residents were really concerned about parking. Our scheme's car free, but they felt that their parking spaces were going to be used regardless. So we've done some work with them since, just to install barriers with fobs, just to ensure that their access remains unfettered in perpetuity. We established there was a lack of green space, and so now there's some temporary allotments that are mobile, so they can move around during the construction phase, and they'll find a home in a completed development as well. So ensuring, and even just like little details on top of that, like ensuring that all the instructions and material is in Bangla alongside English, was a minor touch, but it kind of helped to prove that there was a level of authenticity to the approach. That was all done really in just establishing an early online relationship, which then transferred to outdoor meetings on site. And I think that, in agreement with what's been said before, in that digital really can only ever complement the face-to-face engagement, and it definitely can't replace it and shouldn't seek to either. I've probably run over as well, so I will hand back to you now, Jen.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, I think there is a balance to be had between digital as well as the other offline channels. It has to be a mixed approach to really see value and make sure you are being inclusive and finding ways to bring people in. And you can also use that to bring people into digital channels and almost help in training out that digital exclusion. So I think there's some interesting work to be done there. Question from the audience to you, Gavin. Do you think that the focus on speed will actually negatively impact upon engagement?
It's a good question. And indeed, as I kind of said in my little intro, the reason that we structured our research around the kind of pillars that you find in the planning white paper was to try to tackle those kinds of things head on, and also to try to demonstrate to MHCLG, who we work quite closely with in developing the research, and used them as a kind of steering panel in this, was to kind of demonstrate that there are ways to work up quality engagement that doesn't necessarily add a huge amount of extra time. And I think there are two different aspects here. There's the whole thing about kind of like investing in it early. And I think this is partly what Matt was talking about, although from developer perspective, I think if we look at it from local planning authority perspective as well, because I think we're in danger of kind of discussing local plan making engagement and development, development management type of engagement all at the same time, and it might get a bit jumbled. But if we look at, say, local plan making stuff, which is where the reform agenda is really kind of pressing hard on, around speed, the 30-month question, we knew that any proposals to upgrade community engagement on the part of local planning authorities was likely to be, to hit the buffers straight away in terms of, but that's going to slow us down. So we actually looked very carefully at that question at that point. And I think there are ways that you can look very creatively around the very early engagement and the ongoing engagement before the stop clock starts on the 30-month for a start. Then also you can look at running different elements of plan making in parallel rather than in series. I think there's a whole load of these different things that can be worked on. I also think that traditional extensive consultation tends not to work. And I'm not saying we give up on that entirely, but I think there are other ways of getting in there and reaching and using tools like mini publics. You make sure you have a representative group, so you're using them as sounding boards around ideas early on. And those can be set up and run quite efficiently and rapidly. So I think there are some very, very, it's back to what Kate said. There's lots of very, very good ideas out there. And there are decades now of people like myself producing research, producing academic papers and reports, talking about all this stuff, but we haven't implemented it. What I'm really hoping is that this reform process, let's face it, everybody, what we really need to do is keep changing the planning system all the time, isn't it? But here we are. And so let's try and make the changes positive. And I think it's quite critical that the community engagement, community involvement elements of the reforms have to make a significant improvement on where we're at, because it unlocks and helps in so many other ways. And I think that's effectively what Matt and Kate and others have said, on the call so far. So I kind of long answer to a very nice question. The thing I forgot, Jen, in my intro, of course, is in terms of COVID. And I think, Matt, you may have picked this up in what you've been doing, is that lockdown, in particular, the heavy period of lockdown, really raised the general public's understanding and awareness of what we've probably taken for granted in terms of our built and natural environment and the products of good and the legacy of good planning over time. You know, space standards, access to green space, all that kind of stuff. I think we've been very, very good in this country at planning. People knock it, but of course, we've forgotten some of the basic benefits that good planning has delivered up. And I'm hoping that post-COVID, this has acted as a bit of a reawakening and a reminder of why good planning is so important.
Thank you, Gavin. I think, Matt, it might be helpful just to maybe add some more details around how you've gone from sort of the talk side of it into actually that investment early in planning and engaging the community.
Yeah, certainly. So just to follow on from Gavin's point, there's a couple of quick points. The idea of consultation on local plan is a really good one, but it's quite scary, isn't it? Because ultimately you're sort of asking people to engage probably 3 years ahead of when they're going to be directly impacted by a development. And so if we're managing to speak to, maybe you can manage to communicate with 1,000 people and you can get responses from sort of 400, 500. I wonder if that will drop away a little bit. If it's such an elongated and almost a slightly abstract process. And also, just one small point as well about the impact of COVID on what we were finding. It was exactly what you were talking about, Gavin. We had we went out to consult on a site in Goodmays in Redbridge, and everything was about activities for young people as they came out of lockdown, and everything was about access to green spaces and also to balconies as well. So I'm really sorry, actually, Jen. Could you repeat your question? So I feel like I've just jumped in on the 2 points that I wanted to make already.
No, it's fine. It's more of like, how do you make the time, and how do you actually do it the right way with the community? I think Bob has also added a point without confusing them, because I think it's a confusing process. And I think one part of that is planning it in, and the other part is making sure that as you're planning it in a way the community can actually understand.
Yeah, it's quite resource heavy, to be honest. But and I think that as a result of that, it's always going to be, unless you change your statutory requirements and unless you bolster it somewhat. I mean, we've been doing some work with the Social Value Portal about how they're measuring the metrics that are involved with social value as well, and what they've been lobbying for is inclusion of social value almost within the SCI process, and you can see sense in that, because ultimately, there's good people on this call, but there's lots of developers who aren't necessarily good people and won't want to commit. They won't want to commit that resource. They'll still really just want to kind of shimmy it along and just secure the plan in that way. So yeah, we find that we've got a well-stocked comms department. They do a lot of research up front, and also we'll try and be quite creative in the way that we'll engage people. So if you're actually talking to people about things that really do matter on a micro level, then it's much easier to, I mean, hearts and minds is a little cliche as a term, but do you know what I mean?
No, it's true. I think it is about sort of having a plan and having a team and resource, but I think sometimes that is hard because teams can be quite small. Kate, I know this is something that you're quite passionate about. How do you and the team at Grosvenor make time for engagement?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. So yeah, it's a really pertinent topic for us, and we have a very small dedicated team, and I guess the journey we've been on in trying to understand what needs to change about the way we deliver engagement is that it needs to be a whole business effort. It can't be confined to the community engagement manager, the comms team, the consultants in some spaces. Your project directors, your development directors, your project managers, they need to be competent. They need to feel able and capable of having the types of conversations with communities that need to happen at that early stage we are talking about, and from an ongoing process thereafter. So in a similar way, I suppose, to a lot of businesses are approaching sustainability and our environmental needs at the moment, this should be owned and delivered by your whole business. And the job of myself at Grosvenor and other colleagues on the call, I'm sure, is to try and cascade that movement and that understanding of why it matters and why it's worth spending the time. Because actually, if everyone on a project spends a little bit of time doing this, overall that resource intensity can be managed and spread and shared, and the value of the people making the decisions about that project being closer to the communities, closer to understanding local needs and priorities, is invaluable and continues throughout the life cycle of a project and beyond. So we certainly are trying to be in a place where we are owning this ourselves as a business. We have very limited dedicated resource, but we are trying to bring our employees, our suppliers, our design teams, our contractors on that journey with us. And the charter that we referenced earlier in the call, which I'll drop a link to in the chat shortly, is all about setting the standards so people know what good looks like. They know what we're working towards. And the training program we ran there after launching that charter was about really bringing that to life for people and actually getting them into a space where they're hearing directly from a community member about what happens and what it feels like. And following that learning program, we've actually launched a more sort of a practical guide, how to, if you like, to deliver different aspects of this. So I guess we're coming at it from quite a learning and development perspective in trying to instill and cascade through our business and hopefully in time the wider industry this cultural shift around what the skills and competencies are that in real estate and property and development we should be prioritising, and engagement and working with communities is definitely one of those.
That's great. Thank you, Kate. I think so first part is like understanding sort of how to make the time. And then I think the second part of this is, and something that's asked a lot of questions in the QA, is around the sort of trust and transparency in that process. I might open this up to the panelists, but how do you actually instill trust in the process, especially as a developer where you might be seen as a crook or just wanting to push it through at all costs versus actually trying to take the time to understand the community?
I would say that's quite difficult, actually. You quite often enter a room and are slightly on the back foot to begin with, but I mean, it's not a quick process, and I think that showing that you are aware of what's going on in an area before you start talking with people there, and then also I mentioned on some of the volunteering opportunities that you might take yourself, that your team might do some work on, and also the charities, etc., that you might want to partner with, etc. I think it's for us, it's been all about social capital. We kind of, if you practice what you preach and if you put your best foot forward, you can only really rely on the good people out there seeing the good in you as well. Ultimately, I can't think of any shortcuts. I don't know what you think about that, Kate.
Yeah, I mean, well, actually, Matt, I think you hit upon it in an earlier answer, which is being really straight with people from the off. So not going in with unrealistic promises and ideas about the way the community are likely to want to have a role in a process or the view they might have. So being really clear with people about where the influence is, what they can influence at what point in the process, and where in reality, there is little influence and why that is. So actually, there's a useful tool we've been using recently called a scope of influence framework, which is super simple. I'll drop a link to it in the chat again, but it really helps you think through as a project team over time where there's influence, where there's not, and how that changes throughout the life cycle of a project. And it then helps structure your engagement program around that. And I think in our experience, people just really respect that. And even if what you're telling them is not quite what they want to hear, they do want influence over something, you're saying that there isn't much, they respect that you're being straight with them. And it helps set the relationship off on a productive and mutually respectful basis from the beginning.
I was going to say, Jen, that, in that wider kind of literature, there's a big difference between developing trust and building consensus. There's this kind of, for a while back there in the 90s, people were talking a lot about consensus and consensus building, and that's been pretty much discredited because people just you're not going to get total agreement about absolutely everything. But what you can do, as Kate and Matt have described there, is make sure that the process is is more or less transparent and people know where they stand. And what I was going to say, and the reason I'm interjecting, because obviously I'm not speaking from a developer perspective per se, but I think that my kind of helicopter view of this is that local planning authorities and the quality of plans and the processes that they have in place to make sure their plans really do reflect public interest is not as strong as it needs to be, and it should be, because what it means is it simply leaves far more dissent and far more bad feeling for individual developers to try to wrangle, through individual projects. And it does need that kind of whole system view where people recognize that they're all playing a part in developing more kind of certainty around what kind of development is going to be acceptable in policy terms. And of course, the one of the things we haven't talked about, Jen, so I'd be really, really kind of like interested to see what, Grosvenor and Hadley, representatives, think about this, is we're moving towards potentially a far more codified approach. And that's going to take quite a lot of theoretically, it's going to take quite a lot of the negotiative elements out at individual development scheme stage. And I just wondered what our colleagues on the call really make of that, and whether or not that could be retrograde, or whether or not actually just make your life easier. Thanks very much.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? I think that I'm all for depoliticising the planning process. I think that's having worked in a number of boroughs where there's still an element of playing to the gallery. There's a tremendous amount of politics involved, but at the same time, you still need to engage people along that journey, don't you? There's no if you fell out just straight towards a zoning system, I can see the benefits, but would also be utterly disenfranchised as a citizen. Do you know what I mean? If unless, say, you move into an area after it's been zoned, then what do? Do you simply not move there unless you're happy with that process? So, yeah, I mean, it's I think that retaining community involvement consistently throughout it is essential, really. I think that there's a few questions that touch on sort of NIMBYs and YIMBYs, and I mean, what can you do? There'll always be a certain demographic and a school of thought that don't want to see housing come forward. But there's also a wealth of people out there who recognise the fact there's a housing crisis, and also are respectful of good urban planning and see the need.
And there's an interesting question from Joe from the audience, which Kate, I'll direct to you. But how do you actually get, Grosvenor or other developers to invest in the resources to actually do meaningful engagement, especially when they don't buy the value of it? Because I think it is a key problem, and that's something we're often hearing as well, is that why would we want to use an open, transparent platform when we don't necessarily want that backlash?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so I guess it might not surprise you to know I find it a bit baffling that some companies still can't see the value of it. So I think, there's been enough examples that we've had, immediate experience of as Grosvenor, but as we've all seen in the wider industry, where, when it goes wrong, it goes really wrong. And even if you are coming at investing in engagement just from a risk management perspective, it's worth it for that reason alone. Obviously, the upside and the value you can create if you're actually getting it right, building those lasting relationships, building political advocacy, and actually creating a better place, because it's responding to what people who live there today are telling you, is needed and what its assets are. It's to me, it's a no-brainer, and obviously part of my job is trying to ensure that's understood, and others making the decisions in our wider business are brought on that journey with us. So there is a lot of hand-holding, and there's a lot of educating, and I'm lucky enough, I suppose, to be surrounded by and large people who get it and have seen it and understand the value of it and the risk of it going wrong. So I think it's about showing what good looks like. A lot of people in the industry perhaps don't know and haven't had that experience of it either going really wrong or really good to live by their scars and never do it again. But There's a lot of work going on more widely in the industry that organisations like Public Practice, like Commonplace, are doing to actually just showcase good engagement and actually building that awareness of what good looks like, what underpins that type of principles Matt was speaking around. I think is really growing all the time. And if you are in the industry and interested in what matters and looking ahead, you would be pretty hard pushed to have not come across that. And I think if it probably is ultimately the policy change we're talking about that will result in that sort of whole head turn from the industry in overall terms, but bit by bit, I think it is getting there. So I don't think there's a need to be too downbeat on where we're at, but the case is evident from my perspective.
How important is the data in that story, and do you use it as a way of looking at other longer term business objectives? Is there a case as well to almost think about of an influencer database in some ways for your community that you can maintain outreach with and can help with inclusion? I guess, what is your view, and this is probably more directed at Matt and Kate, with the value of that data to developers? And then Gavin, would love for you to follow that up with that data going into research and actually changing policy.
Yeah, just to give a brief answer and then I'll hand over to Matt. I think this is an area that as a practice we've been relatively unsophisticated in historically. So tracking, understanding who you're talking to, who you're hearing from, what their demographic is, certainly hands up, it's not something we've been great at historically, and we're trying to change that at the moment. But the value we are seeing, particularly to the point I made about knowing who your community is and knowing you're actually hearing from a representative mix of that community, is around the demographic data in particular. It won't surprise you to know, as Jen, you touched on at the beginning as well, historically we've been hearing from typically older, middle class white people. And there's a reality about the communities we operate in, which is they don't look like that. And without knowing who you're hearing from and what their demographic makeup is, you have no way of measuring, how representative truly the response is. So that's one huge area of value that I think policy will probably start to force a greater attention to and more consistent approach on, because ultimately the planning committees need to know that the people in the consultation are representative of that community as well. And then the other value we have is as place managers, the people we hear from in the consultation process are our future customers. So actually using that data that you collect throughout the engagement process to travel through to the marketing phase and be the future customer and user of that place is invaluable too.
Yeah, just to echo that point, the data is most useful to us on a micro level. We're perhaps too small a developer to build up a database of people that may become advocates in an area. We tend to move around London quite a bit, but what we do find is that sort of live real time information that you receive from, whether it's from polling or just from open feedback, if you can feed that back to your architectural team. We had some quite excited architects, to be honest, that we could close a poll on a Monday night and then a project team meeting on a Tuesday morning. They were like, oh wow, they want to see that and they want to see that. And so teams would find it very useful, in not just in terms of, you said we did, but actually shaping the place. As Kate's mentioned there, and of course, and that does lead to very useful data on a sales and marketing perspective, because we don't buy and hold, we sell our homes, and so we don't have that management issue. So it's a slightly shorter engagement process, but it is still very useful in that you can see what an area needs and what people are expecting to see from a development that's coming forward.
I think from the local planning perspective, or local plan making type of end of the spectrum, Jen, it's also about, I dropped in this phrase mini publics earlier, and it may be that some people on the call know what I mean when I use that term, and other people attending may not. So perhaps I should just explain it. It's basically about putting together a group that is representative. So you don't necessarily or only spend a huge amount of time trying to chase down many hundreds of people, many thousands of people, to try to be representative. That you're more effectively looking for, looking at the kind of data about your demographic within your local authority area and so on, and making sure that you constitute a series of bodies such as citizen juries that you can use to discuss options and ideas with, to see how that plays out, to make sure that things are proofed against a particular demographics kind of interests and so on. I think the other thing was, and some of the things that came through in the recent research that we've done, because we also did some stuff on statements of community involvement recently as a kind of as a spin-off to all of this. I've mentioned it at the outset. I put the link in the chat bar. Not many, but it was noticeable when they mentioned it, not many local authorities were very strong on kind of monitoring and reviewing their processes with the idea of constant kind of improvement. How did we do? And in fact, and it comes out in our report, plug your ears, local authority representatives, if you're listening. You're not very good at being your own referees. That there needs to be oversight here. You need to have a panel of people who are holding you to account, and I think that needs to be beyond just elected councillor members on local authority. So
you're shaking your head. Do you have a comment?
No, I wasn't shaking my head. I was in full agreement. I think it also extends heavily to the private sector, who really, in essence, should be perhaps even less trustworthy when it comes to refereeing themselves.
I couldn't possibly comment, Matt.
There's a question from Claire. And the question is, what scope do you think there is for impact assessments to include more community voices? Many of these, transport, health, environment, et cetera, are produced remotely and a template. Would someone like Matt, would you like to take that?
Yeah, certainly. I think that would be really useful, to be honest. What we find is that we'll reproduce certain areas of planning documentation for community use. So post-submission, a lot of the time, no one's going to read a DAS. You're lucky if you can get a planning committee to read a design and access statement. And so the thought of members of the community getting involved in that. So we tend to, I guess, repurpose some of it, and some of it will be the sustainability report, etc., that kind of thing, just so that people can see what a development actually entails. And I think that, an impact assessment, including some more community, any specific statutory framework requirements that could be added that make the process more transparent and make people more informed would be welcomed, I think, by the good practitioners in the industry.
Yeah, I mean, some of you might have seen there's been a number of calls recently for more place-based audits to be part of the earlier stage of development planning, and that would definitely play into the type of content that we should expect to be seeing in socioeconomic impact assessments around what is there today, and the impact that whatever the proposals are on that, good and bad. The other model I've come across recently that is not rocket science but makes so much sense is community review panels. So in the same way you have professional design review panels, community review panels are sort of similar to what Gavin was talking about, a representative mix of a local community that is professionally facilitated and run to review elements of the planning application, whether that be the design proposals or design and access statements or more sort of socioeconomic aspects of it. So, again, there are some really nice examples out there now of where that's happening, and it's embedded as part of the process in a similar way to a design review panel and local authority PPA meetings are.
I mean, that's exactly what our research, tried to kind of focus in on, is where in patches across the country you're getting people trying to do different things, do things better. But of course, it still left plenty of scope for us to kind of, levy quite a hefty critique of where we are and where we might go. I just think that, I mean, I won't add too much more. I think what colleagues have just said there is fine. I think taking it into a slightly different angle, that's one of the reasons why we focused in on principles. The kind of structuring principles for different actors to be aware of and abide by are very important. And of course, you might think that statements of community involvement are the place for that, and I think they probably should be in many regards. But frankly speaking, there's a huge divergence in terms of what statements of community involvement say. Some actually purport to have principles, and when you read them, they're nothing of the sort. And they're certainly, in almost all cases, not something that local authorities can be held account for. They're very woolly generally, and I think that speaks back to what I think Kate was saying, and I was outlining originally about the role for central government in this cannot be ignored. They're going to have to bite the bullet on this. The regulatory environment here has to be polished up, has to be tightened up, so people know that they have to do better, they have to follow principles. And I think then around the edges, you think about these other organizational kind of arrangements, institutional arrangements around things like citizens panels and so on, that help to make it work. But we're going to have to go back to first principles, is what I'm saying.
I think the big thing is just on that and carrying on what you said is make it simple for the public to understand. I think it's probably the biggest thing with all of these strategies and statements and actions that are happening through government is actually translating that to the community in a way that they want to engage with and they can actually be engaged with because it's simple. Just with our last...
Well, quick soundbite then, Jen. Shortest statement of community involvement in the country, 6 pages long. Longest SCI in the country, 56 pages long. And that doesn't include appendices. So you can just see from that the kind of divergences we've got. And I'm not even saying that the 6 pages is good. I'm just saying some are very short, some are very long. Neither probably really do the job that we would really want for 21st century.
No, agreed. All right, well, it's our last few minutes. I think it would be helpful if, for the audience, if each one of you just gave a sort of key takeaway or key learning from COVID that they can apply into the way they're thinking of engaging with communities ongoing. I'll start with you, Kate.
Okay, thanks, Jen. So I guess I'll sort of make a couple of points quickly. Philosophically, I think COVID has, cemented community at the centre of society, and more importantly, in the context of this conversation, business and place. So it's worth investing in, it's worth doing it properly. And I think COVID has shed a new light on why that is. Practically, online is obviously here to stay, but people do want to get back around the table too. So hybrid programmes, will of course be the way we go forward. Which is great and it works, no problem, when you've got different channels running in tandem for the different levels at which people want to engage with the information at. But I think it is going to be more challenging for if and sort of how we try to bring together those channels into one conversation. So yeah, lessons learned from COVID are engagement matters and take digital seriously.
Matt, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. So Claire Coghill, who is the leader of Waltham Forest, she just said that the genie's out of the bottle with regards to digital involvement and engagement, and not just in the planning process, but also something that Gavin touched on earlier. It's on the actual decision-making process and the transparency around planning committees, etc. This sort of pushback towards face-to-face is nothing but a step backwards, definitely. I mean, what even just from a research perspective, just to see how different boroughs and different local authorities are all conducting themselves, it's fascinating. We spend a lot of time watching planning committees from a sort of organisational perspective, and the difference between one and the next is absolutely paramount. So I think that the hybrid approach is going to be crucial. Any attempt to sort of push away and back towards face-to-face, it's really just, it's a step back towards the 20th century, if not the 19th, to be honest.
I would just say, Jen, I would agree with colleagues there. I don't want to add too much more. We're at time as well. But I think the only thing, let's just kind of make sure we're aware, hybrid might be good. but some manifestations of hybrid could be a chimera, could be a real problem as well. So again, we have to be careful about that. And I'm bound to say this, Matt, aren't I? Given as you queued me up, we do definitely want to have good quality research here. And, University of Reading, we're open for business in partnership or alone, but just give us some funding and we're on it.
Thanks everyone for joining. I don't know if Callum, if there's anything you need to say to wrap up.
Yeah, fantastic. And thank you, Jen. And also thank you to our panel for a great discussion just now. And also a special thanks to Commonplace for hosting this insightful conversation in partnership with us this morning. There is still more to come from Real Estate Live UK today. At 3:00, we will be looking at creating healthy garden communities for the new different in partnership with Building Garden Communities and Wilmot Dixon. And later on at 6 p.m, we will be exploring the G in ESG with Bob Wiley, author of Bandit Capitalism. You can book onto these sessions along with those taking place tomorrow by visiting the programme page on our website. That link again is www.realestatelive.co.uk. Thank you all once again for joining us this morning, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you and goodbye.